Saucy Sarah Rarely Sober, a case study of 19th century life around the Port Adelaide hotels. The ageing widow, Sarah Francisco, became a well-known personality in Port Adelaide, particularly in the last 2 decades of the 19th century. Her tragic notoriety was due to her unruly, drunken behaviour around the port and her frequent appearances before the stipendiary magistrate. Sarah's final fame was her complete change to sobriety and lawful behaviour in the last years of her life. This paper is part of a chapter in my doctoral thesis, Pubs and Piety at Port Adelaide, 1840 to 1915. In general terms, the contrast between different elements of town life at the port during these first years were a microcosm of the broader colonial society. At the port, the new townspeople were attempting to establish a stable settlement with traditional values related to their Christian faith, alongside the people whose world revolved around the activities of the seafarers and the wharf area, with the hotels and brothels as the hub of this transient town life. The chapter deals with activities related to the hotels, and this case study is a window to that world. The main source of information about Sarah Francisco was initially found in the weekly police court report in the Port Adelaide News. Sarah was chosen from a long list of similar offenders who were recorded, her name emerging more frequently than all the others. While these reports are tantalisingly sketchy, they nevertheless give a vivid picture of one resident of the port and her struggle to survive against the odds of addiction and tough times, particularly during the years of economic depression in the 1880s and 1890s. Sarah's resilience and the pathos of her story shine through the newspaper's routine weekly recording of events at the court. The articles are tempered somewhat by the reporter's whimsical and often humorous style of writing, which partly relieves the reader from the human tragedy behind the news of the day. The first located reference to Sarah Francisco was found in the Births, Deaths and Marriages Registration Office, which has a record of one John Francisco marrying Sarah Waring at St Patrick's Church in Grote Street, Adelaide, on the 19th of November 1867. On the marriage certificate, John's occupation was listed as seaman. Although the original St Patrick's Church is no longer extant, the church register has survived and records the marriage, which was conducted by a Jesuit priest, Father John Hinterroker. Sarah signed the register with an X, and John obviously laboured over his childlike signature. The register also states that John Francisco was from Genoa and Sarah Waring from Adelaide. In the Biographical Index of South Australians 1836 to 1885, there is no mention of Sarah Waring or a name that sounds familiar, which is an important consideration when a name is unable to be written. However, there is mention of a John Francisco, a master mariner, who had arrived in the colony by 1872 and resided in Port Adelaide. The next reference was found in the Adelaide Gaol Prisoners Register, 1876. At the Port Adelaide Court on June the 30th that year, Sarah Francisco was convicted of the offence of assault on Mary Ann Barnett at Port Adelaide and given a sentence of £5 or 2 months' jail with hard labour. Sarah served the sentence in Adelaide Gaol and was released on August the 24th. The fact that she went to prison rather than pay the £5 fine is indicative of her financial position at that time. 5 days later, she had returned to prison for 1 month with hard labour for indecent language, after having been given the alternative of a fine of 55 shillings. Her occupation is listed in both 1876 jail register entries as housewife. She was described in the jail register as aged 35 years, her religion Roman Catholic, a married housewife, and a migrant who arrived in the colony in 1866, having travelled from Plymouth. References in the jail registers, 1876 to 1888, under the column heading Trade or Calling, record her as housewife, washerwoman, servant, prostitute and charwoman. The register recorded that she was unable to read or write and gives her date of arrival variously from 1864 through to 1868. Passenger list indices, immigrants arriving in South Australia under United Kingdom Assisted Passage Schemes, 1847 to 1886, in the Mortlock Library of South Australiana, do not record Sarah Waring, but list a Sarah Whelan, who arrived on board the Peeress on the 7th of November 1866. In a series of articles in the War Cry, written from interviews with Sarah before her death in November 1916, the central character, Sarah Sullivan, a pseudonym used by the War Cry, travelled to South Australia on the Peeress, helped with an assisted emigrant passage by her sister. The passenger list for the Peeress recorded Sarah as 26 years of age, a single Irish adult, a remittance emigrant, and a colonial passage certificate holder. In the column headed Conduct During Voyage, Sarah's behaviour is noted as middling. Comments for other passengers are good, quarrelsome, most industrious, or no remarks recorded at all. On the 3-month journey, which left Plymouth on the 9th of August 1866, there were 312 emigrants, 76 English, 51 Scotch, and 185 Irish. These included 79 single women and 140 single men. From the War Cry information, Sarah was born in Ireland about 1839, the daughter of a blacksmith. Her mother died when she was 5 years old, and Sarah went to live with an aunt on a dairy farm in another part of Ireland. There she learnt to milk cows, make butter, and bake bread. In 1845, the potato crop in Ireland had been infested for the first time with a fungal disease or blight, Phytophthora infestans, which attacked the stem and leaves of the plants and resulted in half the crop being destroyed. The problem was exacerbated over following years as further harvests almost totally failed. Without their staple food, approximately 1,500,000 people died of starvation in the period from 1845 until 1855. With the health of the population weakened and resistance to illness lowered, many thousands more died in 2 fever epidemics which swept through the crammed workhouses and utter poverty of the damp bog hovels. It was a time of catastrophic upheaval, with the entire working population becoming socially unstable and mobile. Many died on ill-equipped emigrant ships, as 2 million attempted to escape the complete decimation of their families by leaving Ireland forever. Most migrants relocated in North America and British colonies around the globe. During this period, large numbers of young single females selected from orphanages and workhouses were given assisted passages to South Australia to take up domestic service. 4,000 girls arrived in 1854 to 1855. It is likely that Sarah's sister arrived at this time. Sarah was between 6 and 16 during the decade of the potato famine, but with farm food available in her formative years, grew tall and strong as her later years attest. Her height, again unusual in a woman, gave an air of dignity, which the proudly carried head did not contradict, said the newspaper. Sarah started her working life by going into service with a Quaker family, but dreamed of travelling to Australia after somehow receiving accounts from her sister on her life there. In her mid-20s, Sarah left Ireland by steamer from Dublin to Plymouth, the major port of embarkation for Irish immigrants travelling to new lands. Sir Dominic Daly, the Governor of South Australia in the years 1862 until 1868, was an Irish Catholic from Galway, and his background gave a focus to family-based emigration from Ireland during this period. On arrival in the colony, Sarah lived with her married sister, who had earlier settled in Port Adelaide and was employed doing ship's washing, which Sarah assisted in for a time. Her sister had married and had a family. In the War Cry articles, there is mention of Sarah's brother-in-law and a little niece named Mary. It appears from episodes in the war cry that Sarah's marriage to handsome Frank, a year after her arrival, was an extremely unhappy one, with continued violence from her husband after his heavy drinking bouts. The 2 sons from the marriage gave Sarah her only joy, and after her husband abandoned them, Sarah worked hard to keep her small family together. The newspaper report says, when they were quite little, she would set off with one in her arms, the other on her back. She has worked from 3 a.m. till 11 p.m. at night. Hotel work, cleaning, anything at all that would help to keep the 3 together, and food and clothes for all. I might add that these illustrations are all from the war cry articles. After the death of her youngest son, following his fall down an embankment at Port Adelaide, Sarah turned to drinking to dull her sorrow and started on her downward course. The war cry stated that her first appearance before the court on a charge of drunkenness occurred on the 30th of July, 1872. Sarah had experienced 5 years of misery and personal tragedy in the new land and marriage she had hoped would bring good fortune and happiness. In 1878, Sarah served 4 prison sentences, one for being a habitual drunkard, 14 days hard labour, 2 convictions for being drunk at Port Adelaide, 7 days hard labour, and a conviction for disturbing the peace, 14 days hard labour. On the last 3 occasions before the bench, she had the opportunity to pay fines of £1, 20 shillings, and £2, 10 shillings respectively. From the war cry articles, it seems that Sarah's son was cared for by her sister and brother-in-law during her first incarcerations, but it is not known where he lived as her absences became more frequent. The only reference to a warrant being issued for Sarah's arrest is in the South Australian Police Gazette, 5th of January 1881, under Summary of Apprehensions during the month of December 1880, which recorded Sarah Francisco by Foot Constable Ray for larceny at Port Adelaide, 14 days hard labour. It would appear that from that time the police knew where to locate her, or that the nature of her unruly behaviour around the town was so visible and audible that they could find and arrest her near the scene of the offence, making the warrant unnecessary. In later years, she was frequently found on Sunday mornings, sleeping off Saturday night, on a bench in the tennis court shelter shed on Port Road, just south of what is now Grand Junction Road. The first noted reference to her in a police court column in the local newspaper was on Saturday 26th of February 1881, where she was recorded as appearing before Mr. Turner, the stipendiary magistrate, on the previous Wednesday. This report also describes her as a widow. Sarah Francisco, widow, of Iberian descent, habitually addicted to overindulgence in the crater, was fined 20 shillings for drunkenness. The court reports do not mention the type of drink Sarah preferred, although this information is recorded for others, including one offender of a similar age convicted the same day for the same offence. Margaret Cameron, a braw Scotch lassie of 42 summers, for being unable to withstand the seductions of generous Highland whisky, was, upon a previous conviction being proved, sentenced to 14 days imprisonment. In her serialised story in the war cry, Sarah mentioned buying a jug of beer, and on another occasion of drinking porter, a dark bitter brew brewed from charred malt. "I was never so drunk in my life. I had a whole bottle of porter to myself," she informed the court. Research has been unable to uncover any further information on Sarah's husband, John Francisco, particularly where or when he died. The war cry interviews record that Frank one day came home with a pain in his ankle. From this cause he was confined to his bed for nearly 3 years, and Sarah waited on him with a dogged perseverance and patience, often repaid with blows and ill words. For the first year he got £1 a week from the lodge, the second 10 shillings a week. After 3 years he was sent away for a change. He was to be away a fortnight, and, said Sarah, he has never returned for 40 years. The next noted reference to Sarah's appearance before the stipendiary magistrate on Saturday the 14th of May 1881 was more descriptive of her behaviour. The headline said, "Francisco again." Sarah Francisco, of infamous celebrity, again paid her devoirs to the court to answer to a charge of drunkenness. With a brazen demeanour which excited some merriment amongst the spectators in court, she stood with arms akimbo and alternatively volubly addressed the magistrate and abused the police. She asserted that she was constantly watched by Constable Burns, who persecuted her without mercy. She asked the magistrate whether he would like to know the reason of the constable's spite against her, but his worship did not evince much interest in the matter. The prisoner, however, informed the bench that some 6 years ago, when, like dear little Buttercup, she was young and charming, Constable Burns, captivated by her beauty and graces, sought her hand in marriage, but was scornfully rejected. Now he would neither marry her himself nor allow anyone else to do so. The prisoner was fined 20 shillings and indulged in a scuffle with the police whilst being removed. Even allowing for some exaggeration in Sarah's story, it can be calculated that 6 years before, in 1875, she would be in her mid-30s, not a young lady by any stretch of the imagination, and by then a deserted mother with her remaining child to support. 1 week later, she was again before the bench. Sarah Francisco again put in an appearance under the guardianship of P.C. Burns to answer to a charge of being a habitual drunkard, and was sent to jail for 2 calendar months. In 1883, she spent further time at Adelaide Jail in July, August and October for indecent language, 14 days hard labour described as housewife, drunk at Port Adelaide, 14 days hard labour described as prostitute, disturbing the peace and drunk, £2 15 shillings or 14 days, and 15 shillings or 7 days described as washerwoman, and finally, on the 29th of October, 3 months with hard labour for being a rogue and vagabond. Sarah was released from prison on the 28th of January 1884 and returned the next day for 1 month with hard labour for using indecent language at Port Adelaide. In 1862, a third-floor addition was made to the 1858 double-storey female cell block at Adelaide Jail, providing in total 30 cells for women. The block was adjacent to the single-storey 1849 female cell block, where in similar fashion back-to-back cells opened directly onto yards 1 and 2. Young female offenders who were hoped to be reclaimable and not yet known to be of abandoned habits were in a separate yard to those who had previous convictions and were known to the police as prostitute and hardened thieves. In 1857, the Adelaide Observer stated, "There can be no doubt that much mischief arises from the mixing up of young girls with the hardened offenders and shameless women whose very contact is pollution." Debtors were separated from both groups. In 1881, 38 new cells for women were built as an upper storey to the laneway block, with the cells opening to an internal corridor. The women's prison environment was a reasonably healthy one, as the Adelaide Observer description recorded. The wards and cells are as clean as the strictest housewife could desire, the woodwork being constantly scrubbed and each piece of brick and stone being whitewashed every week. As well as cleaning duties, the women under sentence were employed at various times in picking oakum, which involved picking or teasing apart old rope into fibre pieces for use in caulking boat timbers, making oar bags for the English and Australian Copper Company, and carrying out all the washing and mending for the jail. The war cry articles recorded that Sarah had her own cell, the particular one which she had always insisted on occupying during her frequent terms of imprisonment. It had been no secret that whatever prisoner occupied it must evacuate it immediately the rightful owner appeared. Certain privileges must be accorded to a regular tenant. At least that was Sarah's opinion, and Sarah's opinion counted even in jail. On another occasion, the keeper informed her that everyone who comes here 3 times in 1 year has to go into number 1 yard. If I come here 227 times, I won't go into number 1, said Sarah fiercely. So when they put her in number 1, she kicked the policeman fiercely on the shins, threw off hat and shawl, and showed fight. For this she got 14 days and 7 days on bread and water. From this anecdotal evidence, it would appear that Sarah's cell was facing number 2 yard, which was for less hardened offenders. After being released from jail and enjoying 4 days of freedom, Sarah was again convicted on the 4th of March 1884. The police court reporter referred to Sarah, then 45 years old, as an old offender, having been before the stipendiary magistrate on well over 50 occasions. Police court, today. Sarah Francisco, an old offender, was charged with drunkenness and disturbing the public peace, also with assaulting P.C. Randall. She was found creating a disturbance in the street, and at the police station she bit the constable in the arm, tearing his coat and shirt and inflicting a wound on the arm. The defendant made an eloquent appeal on her bended knees to be allowed to go free, but was sentenced to 6 months' imprisonment. The defendant exclaimed, "If I could catch Randall, I wouldn't mind taking 12 months. 6 months later, on the 5th of September 1884, having just finished serving her sentence of hard labour at Adelaide Jail for assaulting Police Constable R. Randall and having returned to the court, Sarah was in trouble again. At the police court this morning, a middle-aged Port Adelaide lady with no claim to beauty, Sarah Francisco, stood before Mr. Turner, SM, on 2 charges of drunkenness and indecent language. Prisoner in defence stated that the arresting constable was drunk, and she showed her bruised hands to the magistrate, saying that the bruises were the result of the handcuffs, which were cruelly placed upon her. The magistrate took pity on her as she only came out of jail on the 2nd instant and mulcted her in the sum of 15 shillings, not to be enforced till the next conviction. She promised faithfully never to come before him again. The next conviction was not long after her faithful promise. Exemplifying the frailty of human resolution, particularly when under the influence of alcohol, Sarah hindered a policeman in the execution of his duty at Port Adelaide and was in prison again on the 25th of September for 1 calendar month with hard labour. On the 16th of January 1885, the Port Adelaide News reported that at Wednesday's police court, Sarah Francisco again presented a smiling countenance. There is no record of her having gone to prison on this occasion, but in the local newspaper of the 30th of January, 2 weeks later, the police court column reported her previous offences and the magistrate's obvious impatience with her in sentencing her to 12 months with hard labour for being an incorrigible rogue. The following list was produced at Wednesday's police court against Sarah Francisco. Since 1875, convictions: 62 times for drunkenness, 14 for using indecent language, 3 each for disturbing the peace of public houses, for riotous behaviour, for wilfully damaging property, and for assaulting the police. Twice each for disturbing the public peace, for being a habitual drunkard, and for stealing. And once each for common assault, for resisting the police, for being a lunatic, for using insulting behaviour, for using abusive language, for hindering the police in the execution of their duty, I like this one, for disturbing the peace of a ship, and for being a rogue and a vagabond. Total 101 convictions. Not bad. Sentenced this 102nd time to 1 year's imprisonment. It is a valid observation that there may have been a sense of security in her second, or perhaps only real home at Adelaide Gaol, because on the 28th of December 1885, after 2 days of freedom, Sarah was disturbing the peace of the port and returned for a further 14 days. The war cry, 3rd of February 1917, stated that, in fact, she had come to look upon it almost as home sweet home. On another occasion, recorded in the same episode, she had just been released from jail after serving a sentence for drunkenness, and according to the police, she warned the jail authorities to keep the same clothes for her, as she would be back again in a day or two. In December 1885, Sarah was described in the jail register as servant, so at that time she may have had some cleaning or kitchen work at one of the hotels. On the 4th of February 1886, described as a charwoman, Sarah was hurried back to jail for an indecent language, with a sentence of 14 days hard labour. The Port Adelaide News reported, Mrs. Sarah Francisco has been convicted for the 105th time. Her weakness is imbibing. This noted personage of the police court is a tall, muscular woman well on in years. She has Irish wit and sometimes keeps the court in continual merriment. When before the court on this occasion, the inspector spoke privately to the justices, she promptly reminded Mr. Doyle he was an inspector of police and added, for the benefit of the magistrate, that it was a pretty fine bench if they needed to be told their duty. Released on the 17th of February, she was back inside the next day for a further 2 months' hard labour for being idle and disorderly. Sarah was discharged from Adelaide Gaol on the 17th of April 1886 and presumably carried out duties as a charwoman at the port for a full month before going back inside on the 18th of May for a fortnight's hard labour, after not paying her fine of £5 for being drunk at Port Adelaide. She was a free woman for the entire month of June that year, but on the 2nd of July was arrested for being a rogue and vagabond and was sentenced to 3 months' imprisonment with hard labour. She was released on the 1st of October, returned to jail on the 4th of October for 14 days hard labour for again being drunk at Port Adelaide after being unable to pay the fine of 25 shillings. From the 16th of October until the 14th of December 1886, Sarah returned to the port, but 6 months' incarceration with hard labour were to follow for being an incorrigible rogue, and she did not return to the outside world until the 13th of June 1887. After one night of celebrating her freedom, she was back in prison on the 14th of June for being drunk at Port Adelaide, with a sentence of 14 days hard labour. Sarah had 2 further convictions in 1887. On the 7th of July, 1 month's hard labour for indecent language, and on the 9th of August, 2 months' hard labour for being a rogue and vagabond. In desperation, the magistrate twice placed her under the Aborigines Act for a period of 12 months. What Sarah termed the Black Act was designed to prevent Aborigines from obtaining alcohol from the hotels and wine bars. The local hotel licensees were warned that a fine of £20 would be imposed if they served Sarah Francisco. For your own good, said the magistrate, I have refused the publicans to give you any drink. Look here, expostulated Sarah, I get my living from the pubs. No, said the magistrate significantly, they get it from you. Sarah responded typically by making a parody of the situation. She was not without a sense of humour. When a disgusted and implacable bench placed her under the Aborigines Act for 12 months, viz. Made the selling of liquor to be to her a punishable offence, Sarah advertised and ridiculed their decision, raiding the streets and crying to all and sundry that she was an Aboriginal. Only 2 other entries for Sarah are recorded in the extant jail registers. On 14th of January 1888, 2 months hard labour for being idle and disorderly. And on the 30th of April 1888, 12 months hard labour for being an incorrigible rogue. It is likely that Sarah spent her 50th birthday in jail in 1889. Both her spirit and her liver were holding out well. On the 16th of July 1891, the Port Adelaide News journalist was back in the police court, reporting on cases being heard by the stipendiary magistrate. Police Court, Port Adelaide, before Mr. J. Formby, SM. Sarah Francisco, who pleaded that under the excitement of being released from jail after an incarceration of 3 months, she had taken more than was good for her, was fined 20 shillings, on default ordered to go to jail for the month. Sarah rated another mention in the local newspaper column on the 18th of September 1891. Police Court, Tuesday 15th of September, before Messrs. Charles Downer and R.S. Guthrie JPs. Sarah Francisco appeared as defendant to the charge that she was a habitual drunkard. Enforced total abstinence for 2 months was ensured by sending her to jail for that period. On the 30th September 1892, the local newspaper journalist reported that Sarah Francisco is doomed apparently to end her days in jail. Sarah, however, still had a quarter of a century left in her life. On the 31st of January 1895, the police court at Port Adelaide provided good theatre, with Sarah, the defiant defender, in fine form. The headline reads, "The Incorrigible Sarah Again." On Thursday morning, the redoubtable Sarah Francisco was brought before Mr. W. Johnson, SM, charged with drunkenness. The ancient offender, whose white locks and hoarse voice with the Irish accent give her a formidable appearance, appeared on this occasion with a broken arm, which she alleged was caused by rough usage from a constable while locking her in the cell. The allegation was denied. However, amid frequent protestations and interruptions from this excitable lady, and the SM preferring to take the evidence of the police, sentenced her to 14 days imprisonment. It appeared from the evidence of the police that Mrs. Francisco had been brought into the station at about 8 a.m. on Wednesday and made no complaint about a broken arm until 4 o'clock in the afternoon of the same day. Sarah was also charged on the information of Sub-Inspector Doyle with having been convicted of 3 offences during the last few weeks and with being an idle and disorderly person, and therefore deemed to be a rogue and a vagabond. "How can you say I'm a rogue and a vagabond?" interrupted Sarah fiercely. "And me scrubbin' and slavin' from morning till night. Have you ever known me to steal anything?" The SM informed her that in a legal sense she was a rogue and a vagabond, and forthwith sentenced her to 3 months' imprisonment. Against this, Sarah vigorously protested, but it was to no avail, and she was dragged out by the police. As she left the chamber, she made a fierce lunge at Constable Morrow, and frequently turning around as she was being conducted to the cell, hurled all the imprecations at the poor constable's head that her Irish tongue could compass. On passing through the courtroom on the way to the cell, she went down on her knees facing Constable Morrow, and striking a table with a blow that would have felled an ox, gave vent to her wrath in hoarse, unintelligible Irish, much to the amusement of the listeners. Previous reference described Sarah as being of Irish descent and having Irish wit. In this report, reference is made to her accent, which had apparently not lost its richness after 30 years in her new country. Sarah's name is mentioned in the Port Adelaide Press on the 16th of August 1895 in a Portland story during a coroner's inquest. The article reported where Sarah was working at that time and her voluntary care of a fellow worker who she had been told was sick. As a witness at the inquest, she was depicted in the newspaper story as being thoughtful, reliable and responsible. The wife of the landlord at the Port Hotel, where Sarah worked as a servant, appeared from the report to have trusted her in a difficult situation. Coroner's inquest. On Wednesday morning last at Wallen's Hotel, the City Coroner, Dr. Whittell, held an inquiry into the circumstances connected with the death of an infant male child of Alice Burgess, who was born on Tuesday morning. Charles Anderson, hostler at the Port Hotel, was at his work about 4:30 a.m. on Tuesday morning and heard footsteps coming downstairs. Said to her, "What makes you come down so early?" She said, "I have been very ill all night, having no sleep," and went to the back premises. Presently she returned and went upstairs. Sarah Francisco, servant at the hotel, said that yesterday morning she was informed that Alice Burgess was not well. That was about 7:45. Took her up a cup of tea. Found her partly dressed and suspected from the appearance of the room that something unusual had happened. Mrs. Wallen went up next and sent for the girl's mother, leaving witness to take charge of the girl. The girl did not confess anything about the child to witness. Annie Wallen, wife of Mr. Wallen, landlord of the hotel, said that on Tuesday morning she missed the servant girl from the kitchen. Asked Anderson, who replied that she was down about 5 a.m, but went back to her room because she was unwell. On learning from Sarah Francisco that something was wrong, sent the hostler for the girl's mother. Went herself into the room and suspected from the appearance of the room that the girl might have had a mishap. Inquired what was the matter, but received no answer. When the mother came, witness left the room. On learning from the mother that the servant girl had been confined, went into the room and saw the baby under the pillow. From the appearance of the girl's clothes, had no doubt that the child was hers. Miss Burgess had been in her employ about a week, and after a day or two suspected that something was the matter, but had not said anything. Sarah Ann Brandon, mother of Alice Burgess, was sent for about 8 o'clock on Tuesday morning. On entering the room, asked her daughter what was the matter. She began to cry and then said, "Well, mother, I've had a baby." Asked why she didn't tell her the trouble before. Asked where the baby was, and on being informed, lifted it out from underneath the pillow and put it on a chair. It was dead and cold. Noticed that the child had not received proper attention. She told her that she did not hear the baby breathe or cry. She said that she had been sillified, not knowing what to do. Dr. Toll came afterwards. Constable J.W. Badams gave evidence that Miss Burgess had said to him, "The baby was born about 7:30 a.m. From conversation with her, assumed that the child was hers. Told him she didn't know what to do when the child was born. The jury, after retirement, brought in a verdict to the effect that death was caused by want of proper attention at birth, but there was no evidence of any criminal intent or neglect. The inquest was also recorded in the South Australian Police Gazette, 15th of August 1895. At Port Adelaide on the 14th instant, on the body of a newly born male child, born of the body of Alice Burgess the previous day. Verdict, that the child came to its death through want of proper attention at its birth, but there is no evidence of criminal intent or neglect. Sarah, as the central character, was in the local news again on the 23rd of January 1904. Sarah Francisco, this unfortunate woman, owing to her well-known weakness, was once more during the week brought before the local police court. On the 30th of October 1904, the press report gave an insight to her incarcerations that year. At the police court yesterday, Sarah Francisca's familiar form was presented to view, and Sarah had to answer a charge of drunkenness on Saturday last. She pleaded not guilty and was fined £1 or a month. She was then charged with being a habitual drunkard. The police records show that she had been sentenced in all to 206 days imprisonment during the present year and had been locked up 162 days. 3 months was added to the present score. She only came out of jail on Friday. Sarah spent most of 1904 in jail. Aged 65 years, with 295 convictions, and having spent between 30 and 40 years, including 12 Christmases of her life in jail, it seemed that Sarah's tale would end with her either dying in her cell at Adelaide jail or in a Port Adelaide gutter. This all changed when the war cry articles were discovered towards the end of the research for the case study. The articles are embellished with many incidents in Sarah's life. The story that unfolded was one that astonished Portonians even more than her antics while being arrested or in the courtroom. It was certainly a source of amazement to the local SM and the police constables at the port, who used her story as an example to others. Sarah had a long history of public drunkenness and convictions, beyond redemption, thought most. But one woman, a young Salvation Army officer, believed in Sarah. When the officer had to resign because of poor health, she stayed in contact with Sarah. The officer married, and as Corps Sergeant Major Mrs. Roberts of Port Adelaide, through Sarah's drinking bouts and prison sentences, remained her friend. Eventually, Mrs. Roberts took Sarah to share her home, and there Sarah was converted and became an army soldier. One of her pleasures in life was to collect money for the movement, and she never hesitated to call on the hotel keepers she had once patronised. Impressed by her change in life, they gave willingly. The first Salvation Army Corps in Australia was formed in Adelaide by Edward Saunders and John Gore at an open-air meeting in the Botanic Gardens on the 5th of September 1880. This was only 16 years after the beginning of the Salvationists movement, founded in 1865 by William and Catherine Booth in East London. The Corps at Port Adelaide began work in the town in 1882. Sarah, in her ridiculous tea-cosy hat, caused many disturbances at the hall, with her many lapses back to drink, interjecting long sermons with, "When's the cup of tea coming on?" and on one occasion turning up with a vegetable marrow, demanding that the baby be christened. The Army and the Roberts were long suffering with her many escapades. The Salvation Army Women's Rescue Home in Gilbert Street, Adelaide, was Sarah's final home. There she had been cared for in her final months and had been reunited with her son, a waterside worker in another state, after many decades of not knowing where he was located. How he was located is another action-filled story. Sarah Francisco died in her sleep on the 2nd of November 1916 with Susie Roberts and the adjutant from the home by her bedside. Her body was taken to the Roberts home in Queenstown, from where she was buried 2 days later at the Port Adelaide and Suburban Cemetery at Cheltenham, now known as the Cheltenham Cemetery. The original grant for her gravesite was issued to Sarah Trelaw Roberts. The headstone faces west and is in the shape of the Salvation Army shield, resting on a plain concrete grave slab. The inscription is simply worded, "In loving memory of Sarah Francisco, died November 2nd, 1916, aged 77 years. At rest, erected by Mrs. W.E. Roberts." Sarah had made arrangements for her burial in her own style. 9 years before, Sarah had extracted a promise from a firm of undertakers to bury her free of charge. "When you see Mr. Haddy," she said to Mrs. Roberts once, "ask him if that promise still holds good." Mr. Haddy had replied that it did, and Sarah had been comforted that a respectable funeral was assured without further expense to her friends. So it was in a handsome nickel-mounted casket that Sarah's body was laid to rest. Her funeral notice in the South Australian Register read, "Francisco. The friends of the late Mrs. Sarah Francisco are informed that her remains will be removed from the residence of Mr. W. Roberts, High Street, Queenstown, on Saturday at 3 p.m. for interment in the Cheltenham Cemetery. J.C. Haddy and Sons, Undertakers, Port Adelaide. Sarah's story exemplifies the strength and resilience of the human spirit against all odds. For so many years, the port's seedy wharfside hotels and surrounding streets and lanes were Sarah's district, seen through an alcoholic haze. Her world was inhabited by similar characters. John Cinnamon, known as Crabby Jack, the asphalt trotters or loitering women, Willis and O'Donnell, the soliciting nun, Louise Clark Wells, who paraded the streets in men's attire, Herbert, an indiscreet bacchanalian, Susan Slater, idle and disorderly, and a washerwoman charged with begging alms. These were Sarah's contemporaries and acquaintances. Around the pubs at the port was a mixture of humour, pathos, and a misery which few of the inhabitants could change. Much of their entertainment was found in the theatre of the courtroom in the cold light of day. Sarah rose above it all in the end through the perseverance and kindness of a friend. Her life stands as a symbol of the struggle between the two sides of Port Adelaide society. Thank you. Well, those people are Mr. and Mrs. Roberts, and this lady on the left is Sister L. Wilcox. And the inscription on the back of the old photograph, which was kindly found for me by David Morris of the Salvation Army Historical Society in South Australia. The back says, Mr. and Mrs. Will Roberts, Sister L. Wilcox, and Mrs. Sarah Francisco, an old trophy reclaimed at Port Adelaide during Adjutant Wyatt's term of officership. 295 convictions drink. That was written on the back.
I have to ask, I know you share my interest.
I think tonight you've heard a wonderful story about a very interesting lady of the port. Port's, over its many years, has produced a whole lot of characters, and a lot of you would know today in Sydney, the state funeral of Mick Young was today. And Mick was a man of great wit and great charm, and a number of the comments that were made in Sydney today were about his wit. I think Sarah was a witty lady of great Irish humour, and tonight's talk by my colleague has showed you the amount of research that she's done and the incredible hours that you must have put in reading police records and newspapers and the war cry. I'm not sure reading the war cry would be the most interesting thing to do. Anyway, I'd like to thank you very much for tonight's talk in the usual manner.